Okay, our next speaker is Gregor.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conference. Thank you for having me. This might be a bit rushed. I apologize. Details will probably have to wait for later. And also, despite having to cram in a lot of things into a very short space, I don't want to skip over the fact that I can't take the whole credit for what I'm presenting here. This is very collaborative work coming out of the Exiled Empresses project, of which also Fons and Sandra are here. But especially Eugenio Petrovic has conceived the database that's behind this, and the main contribution on the part that I can take maybe a bit more credit for is the development of a website, but also there I had help in the back end from Wessel Dankers. So what I'm presenting today is a proposal for how digital methods can be used for doing working in the history and philosophy of science, but also maybe find new sources for people who are not primarily interested in historical questions, or a new tool for pedagogical reasons. And one way to maybe motivate us is that on the one hand, there's a problem of discovery that we all need to solve. There's more material than we can peruse, and among this we need to discover what we want to read closely. But on the other hand, especially if we're doing historical work, we often have to make broad-scale claims that range over a domain that we can't read in close detail. So in some way we need to aggregate large bodies of work, and there are some digital tools that might help in that, and one of those I want to present here. So the starting point is a conceptual proposal. In the studies of the history of science, citation analysis have been used a lot. They've been very useful for clustering, studying the development of new subfields, and so on. So it's a natural idea would be to see what can we learn about the history of philosophy, the history of philosophy of science, from using such methods. But this runs into one very clear early problem, namely that philosophers adopt very formalized citations much later than they've become standard in the empirical sciences. So this is not a very reliable way of extracting all the relations between the works in corporate that we might be interested in. But of course, it doesn't mean that people are all just working independently from each other, writing their articles and not relying on other people's work. So if you look at a random article here on Zeno's paradox, just on the very first page, there's a whole bunch of philosophers mentioned just here on the very first page. And these are all scholarly relations to the work of other people. Even if they're not citations, this document refers to a lot more people right here from the start. So what we suggest is to generalize this document-to-document relation that we know from citation studies to a document-to-scholar relation. So we look not at the citations in documents, but we look at the mentions of philosophers within our corpus. It's a very simple idea. Of course, it's a generalization in the following sense that also most citations include a name of the author, so they will be encompassed in this definition of the document-to-author relation. And so with this concept as a base, we have picked a corpus that is specifically chosen for the study of the reception of logical empiricism in the United States. These are 23,000 articles from 12 English-speaking journals between 1890 and 1980. The JSTOR Data for Research service was extremely helpful for this. They provide directly the full texts if you have a research purpose. And then what we did on the other hand was that we collected names of philosophers, so it's a sort of top-down approach instead of using named entity recognition or something to leverage names that occur in the corpus. We looked for the largest universe of philosophers that we could think of and see where they would appear here. So being as inclusive as possible, we combined Wikidata, the JSTOR authors data from ProQuest and some manual additions, just to see a lot of philosophers that we could find in this corpus. So this is all very simple, but of course it's not as easy then if you want to turn it in practice, especially because these mentions are so much less specific than real citations. You have a massive problem of ambiguity, and of 1 million mentions that are extracted in this way, about 450,000 are ambiguous in a problematic sense. So if we want to find out which of the Russells is here mentioned, and of course it's the Bertrand Russell that has here this ID in our database. We somehow need to solve this ambiguity problem. I can't say, we don't have the time to say much about it here, but at the moment we have 4 different strategies with expanding context to find out which person is referenced in a particular moment, and we have an estimated precision of finding this disambiguation in 82 to 91% of the cases. And now, what can you do after building such a corpus? One very basic way, and this is here where this is really no fancy machine learning, but really just a way of mining large text. You can just count and kind of get a quantitative idea of how the attention distributes over different people. Like see that not only is Carnap somehow an important person, but really gets a lot of attention over his philosophical career. So this graph is just a cumulative number of articles mentioning Carnap compared to other logical empiricists and also other people who were intellectually important at the same time. Here reflecting, of course, also what the corpus is. I mean, it's not like nobody cared about Adorno, but within this specific subset of philosophy and philosophy of science, Adorno just doesn't really make an appearance. And the same for Hannah Arendt. And maybe a dramatic way of thinking about this is that over all the topics, anything that's being discussed in these topics, in these journals, in the 50s, 1 out of 7 articles ends up in some way mentioning Carnap in the end. So it's a very, very dominant figure at this point. For people who are more interested in the institutional perspective, for a limited subset of this corpus, we also have affiliation data based on where people get their PhD degrees, but also due to some work by Jonathan Strassfeld that we have integrated into this data set. And this way, we can also then compare which institutions are associated with this changing attention. So, for example, in the 50s, we see that Columbia University is very strongly dominated still by discussions of Dewey, but also a lot of historical figures, whereas Berkeley is really focusing on contemporary figures, and Carnap has taken the top spot both in Princeton and Berkeley, and so you can start some institutional comparisons for particular periods, and you can also try to maybe reconstruct within a department what the structure of the people working there is. For example, seeing here which people in Yale in the 60s discuss phenomenologists, who discusses logical empiricists, and so on. And then this is the part that I wish I had 10 minutes more to explain. So there's a standard method that's called co-citation network analysis. That's from bibliometrics, where the idea is that to learn about the similarity of different documents, or in this case, we want to talk about the similarity of different philosophers. You look at the context in which they are being cited, or in our case, in which they're being mentioned. So the links that we looked at, this is probably very hard to read now, so don't worry. The links between these documents are not direct mentions of philosophers, but they're co-mention links. So if somebody is mentioned the same document as somebody else, then they get a co-mention link here. And in trying to minimize how far apart we put people on this map that are mentioned a lot together, we can try to build this sort of landscape of debate over a certain period, or a smaller debate, particular journals, and so on. So, and then we made a comparison of the placement of logical empiricists and analytic philosophers and empirical scientists and the context in which they appeared. But this is, in a forthcoming paper, if you want to know more about details. So But now we had all these things. We did all the data preparation. We tested some specific questions. But this data set, of course, it can maybe help with a lot more other questions. So how do we make this accessible? Also, how do we make it transparent to other researchers what we did? How can they find out if something that's maybe implied for a particular philosopher they're interested in, there might have been some bias in the data set or some recognition error in how we handle the texts. Normally, this is not so easy to introspect. We thought about how can we share this database? Well, you can dump it on Zenodo and then let people download it, and then we give them a tutorial, and then they learn how to install the software package, and then I only have to learn SQL, and then have to learn to express their desire. And then we realize, okay, this is getting more complicated because, well, it's a team of historians, and we try to, we want to work on the historical questions and not just end up catching up on how to express these questions in a formal language. So I thought, why not try and make this a bit more accessible and turn it into a web application, a way in which you can just explore this, maybe intuitively, maybe also playfully, maybe also a way that you can use it for teaching and discover perhaps people that you wouldn't find if you search Google Scholar and so on. So the things that you can do on this website now are, as you can see all the places in which logical empiricists mention Kant. You can see the intersection of several philosophers. So if you want to find out within this data set in which articles both Husserl and Carnap would be mentioned, this is something you can do. And there's also an interesting ranking if you in the product of this number of mentions, also an interesting way of ordering these results that's not based on the way we usually maybe choose what to focus our attention on when we go through this large literature. You can focus on, for example, the most mentioned female philosophers in a certain period. Our gender data is incomplete, I have to say there, but also opening it up in this way maybe makes it also easier to extend it further, to correct errors and so on. You can also create your own co-mention networks and interact with them. So look at unexpected connections between philosophers, or find out more about people that you maybe didn't expect in close proximity to a philosopher that you've known a lot more about. And one thing that we tried out was to generate specific networks that are centered around a person. So this experimental way in which this works is to just slice down the corpus to all the articles in which a person is already mentioned, and then build a co-mention network just based on this sort of the history of philosophy from the viewpoint of Sol Kripke, if you want. And if you already know how to write SQL queries, you can also do that. There's an interaction form for that, for more advanced specific cases. So normally I would do like a live demonstration, but I've realized it's not very good because then I end up just looking at the keyboard. So I'll have to show you a video of this. You can try it out now, later in the coffee break, or when you're waiting for the bus on the way home. This is all live. A good starting point is maybe to go to the list of philosophers that we have. This is sorted by the number of mentions. Then you can restrict it to a certain period, for example, pre-World War I. And then maybe you're only interested in people who were born after 1800. You see William James suddenly is the most important person. And then who are actually the female philosophers discussed around that time. And it turns out Mary Calkins takes the top spot. Then you can learn more about her work. You get this kind of overview page we have for everyone in the database. Some biographical data. You can then see the exact places in which we found her, including the context, which is helpful for seeing whether there are some systematic errors, because in some cases, of course, there are. Since she's also an author in our database, you can also look at all the mentions of her work that we extracted, and also get this basic overview over attention to her over the time. So you see, okay, she was very big at the turn of the century, but then this attention fell off quite quickly. So this is one thing. I also mentioned that you can create these networks. This is maybe a toy. Tell me what you think about this. So as an example here, I'm slicing the corpus down to all the articles that mention the Minnesota Center, to just see what this network looks like. This is a lot sparser than what we normally have, so there's only 100 philosophers in there, but unsurprisingly, probably Feigl is a relatively important node in that case. Try it out later if you want. And all of these connections, if there's something that you find interesting, you can click on it and then look at the articles. So in this case, for the connection between Feigl and Feierabend, you can look at what the empirical basis is, in a way, of making this connection. And they ordered by this product of the number of mentions. And then you can go straight to JSTOR if you want to do the real reading. So this is not, we're not doing the reading for you. Of course, you can. It's not AI, I'm afraid. But besides then going to JSTOR, you can also, of course, jump to the overview pages of these individual philosophers in the network. In the case of Feierabend, we also have affiliation data that's included here. Then this is the sort of author-centered network I talked about. And then on the more experimental side, so one thing I wanted to do after looking at all these networks was to maybe emphasize people who are only mentioned in the context of a particular author. So we thought about new ways to normalize the weights. And this is the more experimental version that tries to put stronger connections to Feierabend to people who are only mentioned in context to Feierabend, even if they're relatively small in the corpus in general. But if they don't appear elsewhere, then we have emphasized this here. This is something where we're still experimenting a bit on how to best express this. But this is one thing that hopefully might be useful for discovery of maybe underappreciated figures. Okay, so what I can say in the end is if you're so inclined, go to edify.org, try it out for yourself. And any feedback, I'd love to have it. Also, if there's something missing, chances are we can add it. And I hope it's useful for anyone.
Thank you. That was really delightful. I have a couple of questions. So one is the choice to use co-mentions. So one of the things about co-mentions, of course, is that, because both have to mention each other, it means that individuals who mention maybe a more famous person but isn't mentioned back is going to be excluded from the graph. So I'm curious whether you all have considered creating a version of this that looks only at unidirectional mentions. Yeah, sorry, I think I was too fast. I think I should have explained this differently. So co-mentions in this sense are not bidirectional mentions. So Kant is very big in this data set, but he doesn't mention any of these people. Okay. So these are being co-mentioned means that a third person made the connection between Kant and Carnap, for example, by mentioning them within the same article. I see. Okay. And then the other question is a technical question about the author disambiguation. I'm really glad you mentioned this because this is a huge problem. Yep. The errors that you were seeing, were they disproportionately errors for women versus men, for example? And I wonder, are there ties to authorship practices like women using initials as opposed to their first names to mask their gender, for example? I mean, this is a great question. I don't think I have an exhaustive answer to it. So one problem is, of course, that changing last names makes matching perhaps a bit more difficult. But a lot of these errors are they're not randomly distributed. Particular names are difficult. For example, Alonzo Church is a real problem because anywhere somebody talks about that church, this triggers. There are some smarter ways to filter these things out, and we have to include them. Those seem to be really dependent more on the syntactic accidents of what these names are. One other thing I can think of is Gertrude Jung. For names to be potentially ambiguous, at the moment we have to include also the other person that it might be confused with, but C.G. Jung is not in the data set, so it turned out that every C.G. Jung was considered to be a reference to Gertrude Jung, which of course is not. So I'm thinking of ways to mitigate these kinds of problems, maybe by using a larger set of names to be aware of possible confusions that we don't have if we only look at the
philosophy names. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions. Yeah.
So first of all, this is awesome. You said, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that the data set goes through 1980. Is that, the question is basically, what's the reason for that restriction? Is it just like JSTOR would only give you the data through 1980, or is there something else going on there?
I think this is accidental. Actually, Sander would be in a better position to answer this than myself, but it was originally conceived as a study for this particular project, the study of the reception of logical emphasis in the United States, and maybe not from the beginning intended to be used very far beyond that. And there's no reason in principle not extended into the present, and also we're looking at generalizing this procedure to ingest a larger corpus. So I'm working with a colleague who's also mentioned here now, in extending this to discussions in French philosophy, which comes with its own problems with OCR and so on. But there's no like systematic reason why we'd have to stop 1980. Copyright issues are, of course, the biggest problem. Yeah.
Well, thanks, first of all, for all your hard work. I'm definitely going to be linking it to my Archives of Scientific Philosophy LibGuide. I've seen projects, some digital humanities projects like this connected with Early Modern Letters Online at Oxford. I don't know if anyone knows that. These visualizations, like if you run that one on Leibniz, the picture comes out pretty much like what everybody thought it would have looked like from centuries of working on Leibniz. I'm curious if you have any surprises, things that you would not have noticed, would not have understood or seen now having access to the data in this way.
So this is really a tricky question. So, and one of the reasons to open this up, of course, to more users is that to know whether something is surprising requires so much background knowledge, right? There's, of course, even if you've spent years of reading things, there will be a lot of names that maybe for good reason nobody talks about anymore. And then, yeah, okay, well, maybe that person was important at some point, but it's not who you should be engaging with now. But to really find good surprises, it's important that people with a lot of different background assumptions can look at this, and then maybe they realize the problem is that we haven't included a journal of symbolic logic, which is a shame. Or maybe there's something specific with the name of a person that leads to a result. But I don't think I'm in the position to really give the last definite answer on that. My own background is more in phenomenology. I was actually surprised how much in these core journals I also found discussions of phenomenologists, because I don't think they're referred to as much anymore nowadays. But yeah, maybe this question also goes to other members of the project.
Final question.
All right, thank you. This is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to checking it out. And I know that you can never solve all the problems when you do stuff like this, but here's a problem that I was going to sort of float to you. And it's interesting that you mentioned the phenomenologists, because one of the people that I do like historical research on is this guy named Shadworth Hodgson. And what happens in the beginning of the 20th century is there's a bunch of people who seem to have like literally decided to never mention his name in print. And they respond to his stuff, but they do it like, we all know that somebody could think this, and then they go on and say some things. And Bertrand Russell and McTaggart are like central among the people who did this. And it was a like very deliberate sociological erasure of this person's influence because they don't use his name. And so I was wondering how because a lot of this is just like, who did I think was worth calling out by name? And then there's things that are sort of, it lets people sort of do those erasures. And I know you can't fix that with this sort of thing, but I was just wondering, is there a way or a mechanism of sort of dealing with that sort of stuff? Also, he's a good pre-phenomenologist, and you should read him.
Good, thanks. I'll take note of that. So this is based, of course, on syntactic elements in this corpus. So people who avoid putting somebody's name in print, this is a very good way of avoiding that we find out that these people are important. I don't think there's with this method at least, I don't think there's a very reliable way of doing this. If somebody else here who is more experience with natural language processing things, there might be a way to trace origins of ideas back. I mean, it sounds very, very tricky to do that. it would be interesting to look at that. But I think that's probably a point where I have to stand here and own it. In some sense, this is a way to empirically regiment historical claims, but of course, what is hidden stays hidden for some ways of looking at it, and this might be an example of that.
Let's thank Gregor again.